Hello, my friends. We have a lot to unpack with this stream. A lot going on. A lot of conversations are being had online about a very interesting and influential movie. I think influential is pretty fair to say. Now, whenever we have conversations about backlash, when we're talking about the way films are being received by audiences, I think sometimes we can get a little in our feelings. I know for me, sometimes I read something, maybe it is a very negative review of a film that I really, really, really like, love, what have you. And when this happens, we can all relate. I feel uncomfortable. I feel like, am I wrong for liking the thing? And something that I have grown to find comfort in, something that I've kind of learned along the way as I continue to watch films and have conversations about them on a weekly basis and really dig into them deeper than I ever did in my life. I have come to appreciate a certain type of film criticism a lot more than I used to. I used to avoid a lot of negativity when it came to films that I like, films that could be called sacred cows, even. That's kind of fair to say. And with the case of Soul, once again, this sort of thing has happened. And I want to preface a few things. We are going to be talking about some of the more critical reactions to the new Pixar movie Soul. If you've been keeping up with my streams, you know that I am a big fan of this movie. I really enjoyed it, and I'm definitely on its side. I don't want to tear it down, or I really appreciate it. There's so much in this movie that I think is worth celebrating. And I went back and forth on whether or not I should even talk about or like do something like this, where I'm more publicly unpacking some of the very specific criticisms being heralded. I don't know if that's the right word for it. Being aimed toward this movie, because a lot of people didn't like it as much as I did. That is for sure. There are a lot of people who are kind of, it's okay, it's fine, it's a good Pixar movie. Maybe it didn't hit the Pixar standard that I usually have. Someone might say. I saw a lot of reactions of like, yeah, I like Inside Out, I like Coco. Those movies for me, those are better Pixar movies. This one's okay though. I saw a lot of takes like that, but I also saw some really harsh takes that I wasn't fully expecting. I was expecting a modicum of criticism with this film in terms of its racial sensitivity, because I think that that is a little inevitable when we are talking about a studio like Pixar that is so high profile and has made a lot of mistakes in the past. And there's a lot of people looking toward this film and putting a lot of expectations on it. And I think rightfully so. I think Pixar has earned a lot of credibility, it's earned a lot of clout, and it's okay to criticize it. And it's okay to look at these issues that people are having, and whether or not you agree or disagree with them, acknowledge them. I don't want anybody who has a criticism toward this film to feel like they're being dismissed. I don't want them to feel like their opinion is invalid because I disagree, or that it's not that important if I agree. That could possibly happen. There are a lot of people who kind of look at film criticism as they're looking for agreement. And that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for perspective. I'm looking for people who have different perspectives from me informing a take on the film that I didn't see before. Because when that happens, when we collectively kind of come together and we discuss these things openly and honestly without worrying about offending each other or angering each other because we don't agree, when that happens, movies tend to get better. And so that's one of the other things I want to preface is that films are getting better at this sort of thing. There is progress being made. Now, a lot of people might say it's not happening fast enough. And I would totally acknowledge that. I totally see how that can really feel like the case. A lot of things keep happening in films that are frustrating. For me, I have a very complicated identity. I am coming at this as somebody who, has never really identified fully as Latinx, right? So I am Latino. I'm fully Puerto Rican. I don't have like European ancestry until like one side of my family like hundreds of years ago. But the reality is, I still look pretty white, honestly. Like a lot of people, I'm white passing. And it's something that is a little confusing for me because I don't like to consider myself a person of color because I haven't faced a lot of the like systemic biases and prejudices that people of color have faced. I've faced some things for sure, specifically because of when I've had a Spanish accent or people who do know my like ethnicity and my background tend to draw conclusions about me, and that's not fun. But other people have much sharper perspectives about this. So I'm not objective. I'm not neutral. I'm not it's really hard for me to figure out what I am. And so all I can really do is be honest about where I'm coming from as a kind of white Hispanic is probably the easiest thing to label me, if that's what you want to do. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming at this. And my goal here, as I've kind of said again and again, is that I want to look at these reviews, and we're about to in a second, and I want people to read them, and I don't want you to feel like you have to like righteously defend them, like your take. If you're on my side and you're feeling like these reviews or like these arguments don't click with you, like you don't agree, I think the thing to remember is that when people are writing these things, it's not personal. When I'm critiquing a film and being negative about something that other people love, it's not a personal attack, and it's not people who are in good faith talking about these things. I think the key thing is to recognize that they don't want you to feel bad for liking something. Genuinely, that is the case. I know this from experience. When I have watched something and it seems like everybody else likes it, and I point out things that I think are issues with it, it's not that I want people to like it less. I really don't. And I understand that that's not what people are trying to do here. They're expressing themselves, and they're expressing how they feel about a particular film or TV show or what have you. And they are expressing what didn't work about it for them. And that's really important because the more people do that, the more filmmakers learn, the more filmmakers kind of see these shortcomings and correct them in the future. And so that's why I really appreciate these takes. I agree with a lot of them. I don't agree with every single one. So I'm going to start with that. So I think with that, we should get started. And there's two articles that I want to go to first. And one key thing about this is I tend to not really like read these things in full before I stream about them. I like to have like more of a live reaction. This one in particular, I have not really read. The other one we're going to look at, I have read part of it, but I want to kind of go through this with you, and I want to make sure that we are kind of like reacting together. And hello, Juanes, I see you in the chat. Thank you for chatting. If you guys have any questions and I have time toward the end, I would love to do and ask me anything. I guess it kind of depends on how long this takes. I'm not sure how long it'll take, to be honest. But okay, so this is an article on IO9. It is from Charles Pulliam Moore, and he writes here, Soul feels like Pixar's first black movie made with white people in mind. This was one of the first articles I came across that was kind of making this argument that one of the main issues with Soul is that it's like a black movie with black characters, but it's kind of like a white story, which I found pretty interesting. And I haven't really dove into what this argument is that Charles is putting forth, so I want to go in with an open mind. At first glance, it's not something I think I agree with, but I definitely want to hear this person out. So Charles says, in Pixar's Soul, a music teacher with a burning passion for jazz suddenly dies. The event puts him on a path in the afterlife that makes him realize how he never lived with much passion during his time on Earth, and how hard he's willing to fight for another chance. I should say at this point, we are probably going to get into spoilers for Soul. I'm not sure if Charles does anything very specific. He probably does. So if you do not want to be spoiled on the film, if you have not seen it and you want to preserve that, this is the time to bow out. And I would avoid this video anyway if you haven't seen it, because you probably need that context to have a good reaction to what I'm saying, so you don't just sort of take what I say at face value, because I could be misrepresenting something that is not your opinion, right? So yeah, you probably want to watch this movie before you go any further. All right, so the article goes on. What the teacher, Joe, who is voiced, of course, by Jamie Foxx, finds as he encounters both the great beyond and the great before, Soul's idea of an ethereal plane where all souls are processed before being placed into babies, is a powerful reminder of just what all he lost by untethering from his mortal coil. But all of his discoveries come by way of an unexpected companion who drives Soul's story forward and draws attention to how, despite clearly intending for this to be its first big budget black movie, Pixar still crafted Soul's narrative with white audiences in mind first and foremost. So I'm reading this for the first time, and I partly agree with this. I do think that Pixar is trying to have it both ways here. Now, whether or not that is a good or bad thing, I think is up for debate. But I don't think, I think it is pretty obvious to me that Pixar is making this movie with wide audiences in mind. I don't know if it's first and foremost. I could see that argument because Pixar probably sees their audience as predominantly white. And they might be coming at this as, well, this movie needs to appeal to them in addition to people of color. And I'm sure that's not what they would say. I'm sure that they would say something along the lines of, like, we want this movie to appeal to everybody equally. But when it comes to how they craft the movie and how they make certain creative decisions, I can see where this argument's coming from, where it to some people might feel like the perspective of the majority of people intended to see the film takes precedent over the other. Now, whether or not though this happens in Soul to this extent is something I do not agree with. I'm not going to get into it now though, because I have a feeling we're going to get into more specifics here. So Charles continues, just when Soul first begins to set up how its story is actually about two people learning how to reach across their distances to start a friendship and become more whole people, it's apparent that co-director and co-writer Kemp Powers was brought on rather late into the movie's production. Pete Docter was originally a solo director on the project. Soul's earliest scenes on Earth give you the slightest taste of Joe's musical sensibilities and his obsession with jazz, elements of his character that were fleshed out after Powers joined, in part because everyone felt that particular story should be shaped by a black writer. I don't know how much of this is true. There are reports that Powers got brought on kind of late, but I think we do need to take a step back here when we're talking about the way Pixar films are made. If you know what the auteur theory is, it's this idea that films are really the product of like one guiding vision, and that tends to be the director, especially if the director is also the screenwriter. And I think Pixar movies, though, we do have to sort of take them out of that context. I've been to Pixar animation studios. I've seen them like firsthand how they make movies. And yes, the director has a lot of creative power. In this case, that would be Pete Docter and Kemp Powers. But at the same time, Pixar films are so collaborative. If you really look at the way they put these films together, I would argue that the story artists are some of the strongest voices in the room when it comes to these movies. The director has a lot of say when it comes to the animation and a lot of the early story ideas, which this article is getting into. But when it really comes together and they're putting everything together, it really is a team effort. So I think it is important to recognize this. If you're coming at this film and you're feeling like, this film does not, if this film feels like, a white director and then a black director came on later, I think that's an oversimplification, to be sure. I did see some featurettes with Kemp Powers in the mix and how he sort of did his thing with this film and how he like informed a lot of scenes, particularly the barbershop scene, as you recall, was entirely Kemp Powers' idea. And I think you can, when you're watching this movie, you can kind of tell which scenes he had a really strong hand in. And I think Pixar should be commended. I don't know, commended actually is a strong word. I think Pixar was doing the right thing by bringing in Kemp Powers and by adding more voices to these films to really lend to that authenticity. I think that is a step in the right direction. But of course, we're going to talk about whether or not that totally works. So the article continues, before you really get a chance to attach Joe to these things that are meant to define him, the movie diligently chugs along and finds him unexpectedly falling into an open manhole, an accident that leads to his untimely death and Soul's first turn. When Joe first comes to on a massive cosmic elevator leading to whatever exists for humans after life, I would assume that is what we see in Coco. Haha. He understandably panics and pushes his way out of line, falling off the side and tumbling down into the grate before. There, scribbly beings known as Jerry, voiced by Alice Braga and Richard Ayoade, oversee the development of freshly minted souls, and you can get a sense of what Soul's earlier scripts were like when Joe's passion could have been animation instead of music. I don't know about that because based on the interviews that I've watched and listened to with Pete Docter, soul music or jazz music has been a very, very central component to this movie almost from the very beginning. Now it's very possible that, like, yeah, in the first rounds of this, they were looking at animation because that's Pete Docter's profession. That makes sense. But I think this is possibly being a little bit misleading, kind of making it sound like that Jazz was like a late addition, and it really wasn't. Jazz really was early on in the process for this. Okay, if I'm mistaken about that, I will absolutely correct myself. But that is my understanding based on interviews I've come across. Very possible, of course, that I could be totally wrong about that, or I could be misleading as well. So hopefully I'm not. And yeah, I will do my best to fact check myself on that. Okay. Not being a new soul himself, Joe would normally stick out in the great beyond, despite spending most of the film being depicted as the same sort of blue swirl of toothpaste that all the movies incorporeal souls are. However, in addition to the many Jerry creatures, the area is also populated by mentors, souls of dead people from Earth tasked with bestowing knowledge upon new souls, as part of a larger process that helps define their personalities. In his bid to get back to Earth, Joe is swept up by accident as a mentor and gets to experience what's involved. Not really an accident. He kind of pretends to be a mentor on purpose so that he can stick around and not get sent to the great beyond, but whatever. He's eventually paired up with an ornery soul named 22, voiced by Tina Fey, who's meant to literally be the 22nd soul to have ever been created, who coincidentally has never passed through this early stage of their development despite having had thousands of teachers helping them. I don't think this is true. I don't think that 22's name is that it's the 22nd soul. If you're watching that scene, there's another soul that gets swept up named like 37, and there's another one that's like 107 million, whatever. There have been like, countless human beings, like billions and billions or whatever. So I do not think that that's really the intention there, that it's like one soul, two soul, three. I don't think that is the case at all. I think that my little pet theory for this and how this works is that, like, when a soul goes to the great beyond, eventually, like, maybe it's like reincarnation or something, and like the numbers reset, and because like so many people are dying constantly. I don't think this writer is correct about that, but that is besides the point. Doesn't really matter, not relevant. Okay, Soul's plot revolves around Joe and 22 being forcefully paired up at first, but later deciding to work together when they realize there's a chance of them both helping the other get what they want. Turns out 22 is not interested in being alive and is just fine going through the motions with her new mentor. I struggle to say her. I think 22 is meant to be a totally non-binary, non-gender, just like being with no race or anything. Until he fails, and I'll just keep reading she because I don't really have a choice. She's left alone again for a little while, but they figure that if Joe can find the final piece of her life puzzle, more on that in a bit, see, like, even he's putting it in quotes because it is confusing, can give Joe her spiritual pass that'll transport him back to Earth and leave him with a second chance at becoming an accomplished jazz musician, and Jerry's will leave her be. Okay. So that's kind of like the setup for the movie. I think we've gone on long enough on all that stuff. Once Soul properly kicks into gear, you see how the intention was always to apparently have the movie split between the great before and Earth. To be sure, the scenes depicting the hustling, bustling lives of living New Yorkers are some of Pixar's most sumptuous and stunning to see, but once Joe and 22 are on Earth with a nosy accountant type, Terry, played by the always fabulous Rachel House, from the great before, hunting them down to drag them back, Soul introduces a disappointing but familiar plot twist that ends up changing the tone of the movie in ways Pixar likely didn't want audiences to spend too much time thinking about. And I think I know what we're going to be talking about there. This is like your final chance for spoilers. I'm going to give you a second as I take a sip. Okay, people who didn't watch the movie, you should be gone by now. I do not want you to keep watching. I'm so sorry. Come back later. Joe's physical form remains in a comatose state so long as he refuses to pass on. So he and 22 reason that he can jump back to Earth, but after a scuffle at the edge of a portal to our planet, man, this article is just like a total plot synopsis. Let's go. Both fall toward Joe's body in the hospital. As the duo comes to, they're dismayed to realize 22 has woken up in Joe's body, and he's now inside a therapy cat that happened to be laying on his hospital bed. Soul's far from being the first animated feature involving characters swapping bodies for comedic effect. But here, the conceit takes on an odd subtext because of the lengths the story goes to in order to make you read 22 as a white woman, despite the fact that she's not supposed to be a person yet. I do appreciate that the author here, that Charles, is recognizing that the film is both framing 22 as a like non-human without really a gender or a race, but the film codes 22 that way. And I have seen some reactions to this specific criticism, people being like, well, 22's not, it's okay because 22 could be like any soul, right? And because it's not like really a white person, like you can kind of avoid the criticism of like what's happening there. I think though the problem with that criticism, and I understand because that's how I read the film myself. I did not, when I was watching it, I wasn't that bothered by it. The thing I was bothered by was the tropiness of it, of like, oh, we're doing this again. And like Charles is saying in this article, like this is not new for Pixar. It's not new for Disney. They do this all the time. Um, and that's kind of the reason I give this thing sort of a pass. Like the reason it didn't like raise any red flags for me when I was watching the movies, because it's not like I felt like they were doing it, to intentionally like create some sort of negative like stereotype, or to me it didn't come across like they were trying to downplay black life, and that they were trying to, because I think the rest of the movie disproves that. But at the same time, I do think it's incorrect to say here that like there is no coding going on. And what I mean by that is like, yes, 22 is voiced by Tina Fey. It doesn't matter that the logic of the film says that 22 is not a white woman. I know that they have the throwaway line where 22 is like, oh, I take this voice on because it's annoying. Um, but at the same time, like when you're watching the film, they are doing it. Like they are making that come across. And I think it's up to you, the viewer, to whether or not you are okay with it is totally valid. If you do not like this and if it makes you uncomfortable, that is valid too. I think the whole point is just to be aware of it. You know, I do not think it's wrong to like this movie in spite of this factor. You know, and even if you're listening now and you're kind of at the very least just be aware of why people are uncomfortable with this, even if you disagree. That is all I personally ask, because I'm aware, I get it, and I'm somebody who looks at it and I don't see bad intentions. I don't see an outcome that is very problematic for people. The only outcome that I find problematic is that people are going to be watching this film and coming away from it with a bad taste in their mouth, and that is unfortunate. So we can continue, but I do have more to say. Throughout the film, Soul cuts to moments from 22's past in which she finally managed to drive her mentors, all of them different figures from history, to their breaking points. The joke is meant to be that 22's insufferability is insurmountable, explaining why she's never been born, but it also ends up sort of subtracting from Soul's insistence that 22 lacks the same sort of exposure to life experiences that other souls have. At one point, when they're discussing the nature of Priya's soul's personalities and presentations, 22 cycles through a number of different voices before explaining that she chose Faye's specifically for its annoying quality. While that logic might hold up to a point within the context of the movie, as an audience member, the explanation reads more like a diagram of the thought processes that led to Faye's casting and how we're meant to find it inherently funny. I agree with that totally. I do think that that's what they're going for. I think I think that it is important to look at this from like Pixar's shoes and how they kind of went about this with 22 and how they usually do like the buddy comedy thing. And with Tina Fey, you had all the success with Inside Out with Amy Poehler, voicing Joy. And I genuinely think that's like where this place is coming from. They thought that Tina Fey would do a good job voicing the character. And as it happens, Tina Fey does. In my opinion, I think that Tina Fey voices this character really well. And I don't think that it's logically inconsistent that 22 doesn't have, like, 22 doesn't really have life experiences. 22 just sort of like goes through the seminars and sees it from afar, but the movie is kind of saying like, no, when you actually like live life and you can feel things and you can like touch and like eat food, that can maybe change your perspective of why life is worth living, even though it looks like a hellscape. So I don't really agree with that particular call out here, but again, that's kind of like an irrelevant aside. The wonder and surprise that 22 feels as she experiences living for the first time are meant to be magical to witness, and it is to a point, but this aspect of Soul's story is often warped in ways that feel gross, not just because 22's piloting Joe's body to do simple human things that she never has, like eating, but because some moments very much feel like they should have been Joe's to experience with his new lease on life, like when the pair of them end up in a nearby barbershop. So before we talk about the barbershop thing, that is an important thing to talk about. I get the point of this. I understand it's like you want Joe to experience these things so that he sees, what he's been missing. But I think that wouldn't actually work for this particular story. Whether or not it would be like ethically better, I think that the thought process from the screenwriters here was Joe is Joe has been experiencing these things firsthand, right? His whole life. But he's been kind of missing it. And 22 is the polar opposite. She's been watching it from afar, but she hasn't experienced it. And when you switch the perspectives, they both learn something because it's the thing that they were missing. And I actually do think that is smart screenwriting because it's not until Joe is outside of his body and he sees like what is happening like apart from him. It's the same thing that happens in like classic films, like and classic stories, I should say, like A Christmas Carol. It's not that Scrooge is like in those moments in like reality, seeing what what he was missing. He has to sort of be apart from it. He has to be a more objective observer and see what's happening and then like realize what he was wrong about. The same thing in It's a Wonderful Life when the main character in that film is like looking at what is happening outside of his perspective. That's really what they're going for here, and I do think that it is a smart screenwriter thing, and I think it does have the unfortunate baggage of having that racial component. And there's a lot of people who I've seen say who are like, well, maybe this would have been better if 22 was voiced by somebody of color, and you could maybe sort of avoid some of this criticism. I don't know if that's true. Maybe it is. I think that like you kind of run into this problem either way because I think people were kind of going into this movie really with their guards up. And what I want to say, if you're listening to this and you're kind of feeling like this is much ado about nothing, it's not. It's really important that when people watch these films and it does make them uncomfortable and it does bring up like these microaggressions, these things that are just like, man, this again. I think it's really important to take that seriously and to, because Pixar's not going to do a better job next time in that regard unless it gets called out. And yeah, so we'll keep going because I don't think I'm done at that point. All of Joe's and 22's antics on Earth revolve around the two of them rushing to get his body prepped for a gig later that evening that he needs to look sharp for. A gig he happened to luck into before his accident at the beginning of the movie. Partial luck. And I don't even know if it is total luck because he did work hard to get to that point. He had to impress at the audition. He had a really good impression on his student, the drummer, voiced by Questlove Curley, who is who calls him up. So it's not total luck. I think that's a little bit of a. I would have rewritten that line a little. I don't know. That's a little unfair. Um, Again, not important. Part of Joe's process involves getting his hair cut, and though he never expresses if his hair holds any particular significance for him, everything about the way Soul beautifully animates the barbershop scene conveys a significance you're meant to read into the space itself. Yeah, I guess it doesn't. I don't know if you really need that for this story. I think that's up for debate. I think there is a lot of like storytelling around like how Joe sort of views himself appearance wise, and how he presents himself. There's a little bit of that, but yeah, I don't. The movie does not dwell on a lot of this. I think possibly because they didn't see a need for it, and or they thought it might make him seem vain to audiences and therefore a little unlikable. But I'm not sure. The barbershop, like the scenes in which Joe and 22 interact with Joe's seamstress mother, voiced by Felissa Rashad, she's fantastic in this film, are moments in which the film distinctly feels as if it's taken you into black spaces where Joe's interiority is more easily recognizable and expressive. But Soul frames these moments as belonging to 22 in a way that detracts from the movie's message because they imply that Joe himself was never properly comfortable in them prior to his adventure. This is something I do disagree with. I don't think we really get any sort of indication that Joe is not comfortable with this stuff. And again, up for debate. I've seen the film twice now, and I don't think that it's. I think the word is complacent. I think Joe has sort of just glided through life. The message of the film, whether or not you believe it's executed correctly or not, is that Joe learns a lesson about how he has been sort of so obsessed with one dream, he's ignored everything else around him that's good. And it's not specifically like a black experience. It's a universal thing of like being in a public space and joking with people and connecting with people. And what I like about this movie is that it does use unique and very specific black experiences to get that across because it normalizes these black experiences. It reveals them to a certain audience. And that I think gets into what Charles brought up before, which I do partially agree with, which is that Pixar did make this with white audiences in mind. Whether or not that's first and foremost is a little bit of a trickier subject. I think possibly, yeah, because I think Pixar sees it as like white audiences make up the majority on a financial basis, even though they would never admit it, because can you imagine if they admitted that's pretty messed up. But I do think that's a big part of it. And I do think that the people who put money into this film saw this as a huge risk of making this a very specific black film or a specific set of like black scenes. And the fact that it still got made is, I think, a good thing. But yeah, we can keep though digging into these criticisms, because it's not that I'm saying these criticisms aren't valid, but I do think they're worth unpacking, and I do think they're worth contextualizing, specifically with Pixar's intentions here. And no, I do not think that, like, this is almost sort of implying, and I hope I'm not wrong. I hope I'm wrong about this, but it's almost like the author is kind of implying that, Joe, like, has, like, there's an issue with these experiences, or like Joe was like, I don't know. I never felt like this film presented Joe as somebody who feels out of touch with his black identity. I just don't see that in this film at all. But who knows? I've seen it twice, and I'm not sure if the author is saying that, so I don't want to misrepresent. Okay, after 22 threatens to toss Joe out of the barbershop at the barber's insistence that the cat behaves, she ends up having the kind of deeply meaningful conversation with the man that Joe never could due to his feeling uncomfortable expressing himself. It's in scenes like this, or later in the film when Joe interacts with his mother and her friends, all of whom are black, that Soul comes across less like an earnest and casual celebration of everyday blackness, and more like a twee depiction of what it's meant for white audiences' consumption. Even though Soul has two leads, this dynamic highlights how the movie often ends up treating Joe as a supporting character. His relative otherness to 22, who again reads as white in every aspect save for the character's looks, is supposed to be the wondrous life-changing thing that ends up giving 22 her spark to become a person. I half agree with this. The thing that I agree with, I do think that there is a very touchy subject here in which Joe in this movie does sort of feel like it is a little icky that he is like learning like the good nature or like the positive things about his identity and his like his life through this like other. And even though 22 is not technically a person, it is coded in a way that like it's taking like a white character, even though she's not technically white, I understand. It's taking a white character to like make him realize that. Now, ultimately, that's not my read of the film, because I don't necessarily think that that is the text here, but I do think that there's a strong argument to be made that that is like an unintentional subtext. And this is a really hard problem to solve, as a screenwriter, because they have a flawed character in Joe. And it would be wrong if he didn't learn anything on his journey, right? But, and then the thing I don't really agree with is like, it's almost like this film is kind of saying like it might have been better if it had been a Lovers Rock situation. Lovers Rock is a small axe film from Steve McQueen. It came out on Amazon Prime, and that is kind of getting at what the author here is saying about how it's like that is a casual celebration of everyday blackness, and this movie is not that. It has that. It is celebrating like that everyday life, but it's about how like one particular black person sort of just did not appreciate it or did not really get into it in the way that he might have or should have been able to. And so I do have to agree with this. I do think that there is something here that I certainly can understand, but I just don't agree with this idea that Joe is a supporting character. I really walked away from this film feeling like 22, it is a two-hander, and I think that he is like the stronger presence. He's the stronger character, more well-rounded. And I think that this really is his story. And it's him learning a very difficult lesson. I think 22 learns their lesson like almost a little too quickly, which could be a criticism of the film. And, you know, I kind of go back and forth a little bit with 22 in that regard. But all right, I think we're getting toward the end of this article. And so far, you know, I think this is a really thoughtful article. I think this is, even though there are obviously plenty of quibbles I have with it, and even though I don't fully agree with it, it is important stuff. And it is stuff that like is getting at something that I think is going to resonate with people who watch the movie and wonder why they don't like it as much as they want to. I think I can definitely see that being the case, but let's finish this out. For all the promise that Soul had of being Pixar's big-bodied, full-throated love letter to jazz music that centered a black lead, in the end, the movie barely delivers in any substantive way. By featuring a smattering of gorgeous visuals, spotlighting different black skin tones and hair textures, Soul shows us that the studio has the technical skills to make movies like Soul shine aesthetically. But when it comes to telling stories that don't find a way to center white people and their gazes, Soul proves that Pixar is out of its depth. And this, I think, this is the part where I really just do not agree. When I watch Soul, and you know, I want to be careful here because I don't want to make it sound like this person is wrong to think this, or that like, you know, that I'm superior in any way. There's nothing going like that going on here, but this is just not how I read this film at all. What I read in this film is it is using a black setting and a black character to speak universal truth in the way that quote unquote white perspectives tend to do. And that is the thing that I think is really great about this film is that it is saying black films don't just have to be about black struggle. They don't just have to be about racism. They don't just have to be about serious social issues. You can have an animated, all ages family film where the character happens to be black and there is like a sort of authentic black setting wrapped into it. And people of all skin tones, people of all backgrounds can watch it and learn the same lesson from it. And I think that it's a little, I do think it is slightly unfair here to kind of say that Pixar was just trying to make like a white movie with, and score diversity points or something. Maybe that's what they did. I mean, I'm not them. I don't know what their true intentions are, but the outcome is not that. The outcome is not a film that I think like excludes, people of color. And I don't think that, and I hope I'm right about that. But again, it's hard for me to say that as somebody who is white Hispanic because I don't identify directly with these characters, but I certainly had tons of connection with them regardless in my own background and how I feel about my connection to music, my connection to my family, which is very different from a lot of other people's families. And yeah, I just had a completely different takeaway from this film. And I am certainly open to this perspective and understanding like why it's coming across that way for this author in particular. And I know a lot of people are reading this and agreeing with it. And I think it's going to take a lot more introspection. I think this is like the main brunt of the backlash. I had another article here from a different author, Kirsten Acuna, who kind of said that this film like left her cringing for the most part. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing because a lot of it, this is the one that I read a little bit more of compared to the last one. It's kind of getting into some of the same territory, although she makes a lot of different points. But I do encourage you to read this as well, even if you disagree. And I think that like this is more of the like meh sort of reaction to this movie. It gets into how just like the message it sends that like Joe is killed very early on in the film. And, again, this is another situation where I agree in part and I disagree in part, I think that there is room for movies like these to be about more than like I'm a little flustered because I don't know exactly how I feel about it. I want these films to be more. I want films with people of color to be more than cultural representation. I want them to be universal. That is a priority for me. That is something I really enjoyed about Coco. That I felt like people watched Coco and they got something out of it no matter who they were. And I want these films to get better and better at this sort of representation. I think it's super fair to point out that no, Soul is not like Soul is not a perfect film when it comes to racial representation. If even I'm picking up on things, and I did throughout this movie, that I've just found like very strange and very like, that's important to recognize. It doesn't mean you have to dislike the film. It doesn't mean that you have to suddenly change your mind about the film because you feel pressured to or anything. If you're feeling like, reading or listening to me about any of this is making you feel obligated to dislike this film, please do not go down that road. Please. Because that is not the intention. What these folks are trying to do is just honestly, and me, we're honestly just trying to bring things up and be more aware of them, that they exist, that there is weird stuff going on here that Pixar could have done a better job with. I definitely think that is the case. They could have really ironed this stuff out, and this movie could be more universally celebrated, and that would be great for everybody. But it's not. There's a lot of like meaningful criticism being heaped toward this film, and a lot of it is coming from a very good faith place. So that's kind of where I want to leave it. I think I just, I don't want to keep going down this path of like, argumentation or anything like that. I think these authors have done a really great job outlining how they feel. And even though I don't agree with everything, I do think there's a lot of strong stuff here to appreciate. So that's the Soul backlash for now. I think it's definitely not over anytime soon. I think people are going to be dissecting this movie a lot, and I maintain that it is fantastic. It is a fantastic film, and I'm so glad that it exists, and I'm glad that it's making people think, and I'm glad that it's it's deep enough that people can look at it this critically. I think that is a merit. Sometimes films are just so empty and shallow and meaningless, and it's just more IP ripping, and it's not as fun. It's not something that I think is all that valuable to the world. But this film certainly is, and I'm really glad. I'm really glad I got to talk about it in this way, even though it's a little scary. It's hard to talk about stuff this like sensitive because I definitely don't want anybody to come out of this feeling uncomfortable or cringe or anything like that. So I did promise and ask me anything here, and we've got some questions. I'm excited. I'm gonna take a quick sip. Mm. You guys get to experience my first time doing a live stream with a preamp. I have no idea how it's going. For all I know, the audio could be absolute garbage right now, so I apologize if that is the case. I did do a test and it seemed to be fine. But okay. Juanes wants to know, do you think Soul is way too short? Oh, man. I'm going to think about that. I don't think it's short, to be totally honest with you. I think it's just right. When it ended, I felt like we got like exactly what it needed to be. I don't know. I never felt like it was missing anything. I don't know if anybody agrees to that. I'm going to create a little banner here that says, ask me anything. And I'll add that there. So now you can see it. Okay. Still kind of learning the tips and tricks with this. Yeah, I don't think it's too short. I'm curious if anybody thinks it's too short. I don't know. When it comes to Pixar films, there's not a lot that I felt like I wanted a lot more out of them. They tend to actually like not overstay their welcome, but give me a little extra. Like Monsters University is a good example of that. Let's see. Glad to see you back on YouTube, John. Thank you, Network 1901. Very aware of your stuff. Pete Redo, a lot of people don't like 22. And yeah, I see someone Juana said I did like her. I go back and forth on 22. I don't know how I really feel about this character. There are times, like in the second watch especially, 22 makes me laugh. Genuinely. I think the scenes where 22 is kind of annoying to me is like, I don't know, some of the like Earth stuff that 22 goes through is kind of it wasn't fantastic for me. It wasn't my favorite stuff in the movie. She kind of reminds me of Vanellope from Wreck-It Ralph. Yeah, I've seen this a lot. Like their dynamic is very similar, and it kind of in relation to this conversation. If Pixar had made a film where instead of Jamie Foxx voicing Joe, if Joe had been like a white character or maybe an Asian character or Hispanic character like me, uh, how would this film be interpreted? Would people sort of be saying the same thing? And I think possibly because I remember when I was watching Coco, there were a lot of folks, like I'm not Mexican, but I do know a lot of people who are Mexican, and they were really annoyed with some things that happened in Coco, that specifically with like some immigration stuff that film did. And yeah, that was definitely worth bringing up. And I think no matter who like Joe was sort of being like represented as, there probably would have been some critique on this. It just sort of depends on like what type of critique it is. It could be a racial critique in this sense, but in that critique, it could just be like leaning more on like the body trope stuff, and that's valid too, I think. Okay, what do you think about the canceled Monsters Inc. sequel? I don't really know anything about a canceled Monsters Inc. sequel. I know that they're working on Monsters at Work, the Disney Plus series. So yeah, not much to think about there. I don't think that you have to understand that with Monsters Inc., that is a hard film to make a sequel of, which is why they made a prequel instead with Monsters University, because the premise of the film really gets squashed a bit when the monsters are now making kids laugh, and you don't have as easy ground um, what's the word? Story, I guess, or stakes. It's like, there's not much left. I think these characters have sort of reached their logical endpoint. Like someone said, lost in Scaradise. Yeah, to be honest, I don't really know much about that. So I don't really have an opinion. Do you think it would have somehow affected your theory? I don't know. Who knows? Everything affects it in some way. What are your thoughts on the new Disney movie Encanto? Do you think it'll be as good as Coco? Yeah, that's Walt Disney Animation, so it's not Pixar, so it's going to be very different. I think that it's going to be way more like Disney aesthetic than Pixar aesthetic, which is great because we don't really have like animated Disney films that go to a more like Latin America realm. We do have Coco, but that's Mexico. We have some of the first Disney films. We have like the Three Amigos and stuff like that, which was like a lot of that is in South America. It's mainly like Brazil and stuff. But this will be Colombia. which is close to my heart. My aunt is Colombian, and my family's Puerto Rican, but she's adopted, and they adopted her from Colombia. Um, but yeah, that said, Colombia is a really beautiful country. I've never been, but everything I've seen about it, I think that they can make a fantastic animated film in this way. I hope there's a lot of great music, which is kind of implied by Encanto. I like the idea that Stephanie Beatriz is going to be in the film potentially. It looks like, and yeah, I don't know if it'll be as good as Coco, but I won't be. I probably won't be comparing it to Coco. I'll probably be comparing it to more like Disney animated films, and I guess it depends on how the teaser presents it. The only teaser we've seen is kind of just like there's like music playing and leaves blowing, and we really don't have a sense of like what this movie is yet. Did you not like Soul? If you listen at the very beginning, I did get this out of the way, but I guess I didn't bring it up too much. I love Soul. I loved this film, even especially on the second watch. It just really brought me to like such an emotional place. It features one of my favorite genres of music, if not my favorite genre of music, which is jazz. I listen to jazz every day because that's like my choice of like what I like to work to when doing anything like editing or writing or anything. I love listening to jazz film music. If you want to get into jazz yourself, Coleman Hawkins is one of my favorites. Herbie Hancock, like most people, but I'm a sucker for jazz. So it's a big reason why I really enjoy films from like films like La La Land, Whiplash, and all that. Okay. Um, yeah. So Juana's. Oh, you're from Colombia, so I hope the film is accurate to your experience and your country, and we'll see. Yeah, Disney has a okay track record with that sort of thing, I suppose. It just depends on the studio. In fact, now that I think about it, most of their animated films tend to be like not really outside of like America as of late, right? Um, we are getting another one, Raya and the Last Dragon, which will be like Vietnamese fantasy. So that'll be another indication of like how Disney is doing that way. It's important to point out that Jennifer Lee, who was the director of Frozen, Frozen 2, she is kind of like the head of like Walt Disney Animation right now in a very creative capacity. And we're gonna kind of see the fruit of that pretty soon. We're gonna kind of see where she's steering this ship ever since John Lasseter had to step down. He stepped down kind of around the time that we were getting films like Ralph Breaks the Internet. So yeah, we'll see what happens. Okay, what are your thoughts on how Soul may fit into the Pixar theory? I've seen many people thinking 22 might be Riley. Yeah, I don't agree with that. I don't think Soul takes place around the time that like because the theory doesn't make sense because in Soul we see smartphones, right? And so it's implied that Soul is taking place around our modern time. For 22 to go to Earth, that would be 12 years before Riley was born. Riley's born probably more in like the late 2000s. Based, if you look at the Pixar theory timeline, there's a strong indication that Riley is like that movie takes place more in like 2006, 2007 because of Finding Dory and because we see Riley in Finding Dory. So Riley was probably born in either the early 2000s or like the late 90s. And Soul absolutely does not take place in the late 90s in the Pixar timeline. So no, I don't think 22 becomes Riley. I know people are trying to say like, oh yeah, please, figure out who 22 becomes. And I think that could be a fascinating facet of the theory. But yeah, I don't think we know yet. There's no character I've thought of who's been like a great candidate for 22. If I had to pick somebody, it would probably have to be somebody who's like, you know, we don't know yet, or somebody more in like the future timeline. Maybe the president of the world in Wally, which is in 2105. Yeah, probably not. Those timelines don't match up either. Yeah, I think that's going to be down the road. I think that we'll probably come across a Pixar film eventually that makes more sense, especially because 22 is supposed to be such an old soul, and 22 has like the mentorship and such a weird personality. I don't see that personality in any Pixar character we have to date, personally. So, yeah. I've wanted an Italy film from Pixar forever, so I'm so excited for Luca. I am too. I know nothing about it except that it weirdly seems very similar to Call Me by Your Name, um, just in terms of like the setup and not literally. It's not like a a romance. It seems it looks like it's just a boy and his friend, and maybe there's like a monster or something. Um, yeah, I think the only sort of like Italian thing we've gotten from Pixar is what the director did before, which was La Luna, which was the short. All right, I don't see any more questions, so I think I'm going to go ahead and call it. Thank you, of course, for watching this, and to all of you who are already subscribed, please subscribe and ring the bell if you want to know whenever I'm going live. I try to go live most days, just sort of depends on what's happening. But yeah, I hope you got a lot out of this. I hope that you feel like you have a little bit more context of where people are coming from when they criticize this film on its racial material. And if you're somebody who agrees with a lot of those criticisms, I hope I did a decent job of outlining how I feel about them without disrespecting anybody's opinion or how they feel about the subject. Please be nice in the comments. Do not yell at each other. And you all have an amazing rest of your holiday 2020. See ya.